Thank you, Naveen and colleagues, and thanks to the African Studies program for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. And as I mentioned to Aliyah, I agree wholeheartedly that we should dismantle the old lines, colonial lines in Africa, and think about our connections and to build critical knowledges together. So I will start with something about the book cover of the image of the cover of the book. This is the image cover of the book, and I had and if you notice, this is a famous iconic image of the Tahrir Square, the one that was globalized, and social media helped disseminating the story and so forth. So when I was trying to think about this book and to convey some of the ideas in the book, I wanted to challenge this iconic image and to bring the revolution on the ground with lots of uncertainties. And it was really difficult for me. So I asked a friend who, not a friend, was an acquaintance from the revolution struggle, who was a former political prisoner. And actually he drew a lot. His name is Yassin Muhammad. And I told him I need to convey something to challenge this image. I'm sharing this before starting with the talk, just because it's a very special audience. I thought it would be good to share something about the cover image. So this is the iconic image, and this is the book, but this is the real image that he drew for me. So I told Yassin, I don't want to see the final image. The revolution is full of unpredictabilities, and I will discuss this in a second, but I want to see the revolution in the making. While rallies are still coming, the camp is not formed yet, and there's lots of sacrifices and blood. And you see the right bottom corner is roses, bloods, and barricades are like fused together, and that was part of the story. But lots of the rallies are still coming, and lots of battles towards liberating or taking over the square. So I hope the image conveyed and so forth. So this is the outline of my talk. I'll start with a vignette from the book and go through some of all these issues, some of the main questions, my overall epistemological, analytical approach, methods, and then I'll focus on the idea of revolution as lived contingency. I landed in Cairo, Egypt, in the early morning of February 4th, 2011. The trip to Cairo had taken almost 48 hours because of a curfew imposed by the military. My parents were surprised to see me. I had been in Cairo only 3 weeks earlier and hadn't told them I was returning so soon. I worried that my parents, who were not particularly political, would urge me to stay away from the protests in Tahrir Square. As I expected, they were quite upset when I told them I was headed there. For them, Tahrir meant nothing but trouble, violence, possibly even death. Around 8 o'clock in the evening of January 28, 2011, the military had deployed throughout most of the nation's urban centers. The police force had broken down after days of sustained clashes with protesters. At that point, my parents and most Egyptians were subjected to government propaganda telling them there were foreigners and spies amid wild-headed kids in Tahrir, and all of them were hell-bent on destroying the nations and its stability. I stammered as I made up a story for my anxious parents. I'm not going to Tahrir Square. I'm only going to the area near Tahrir to interview folks from the protests. I have to do this for my PhD research with my advisor. I was lying. I didn't know exactly what I was doing. I only knew that I wanted to take part in what felt even then like history in the making. Thinking of their fear and of my spouse and 4-year-old child back in the United States, I promised I would come back and sleep at home every night. As the days wore on, my parents' reluctance to let me go to Tahrir dissipated. They grew more sympathetic, asking questions about developments in the square. But I felt twinges of shame about returning home every night. I had been a socialist and a human rights activist and knew that important work happens after dark. That when the serious conversation began, or so I naively believed at the time. At night, when there were fewer protesters, the camp needed the most support. I chastised myself that even though I spent every day in Tahrir, I wasn't brave enough to be part of the camp at night. Nevertheless, my time near my parents' home allowed me to participate in the interesting workings of what Egyptians call the popular committees, or Ligan Shabiya in Egyptian Arabic. Egypt was in security crisis, and the military was ill-equipped to take over policing. So while the armed forces focused on hotspots, citizens spontaneously and brilliantly organized neighborhood committees for security. They spread everywhere. Lightly armed citizens stood along main streets and down smaller alleys, keeping a vigilant night watch over their neighborhoods. Citizens, revolutionaries and non-revolutionaries alike, became both executive authorities and agents of the revolution without realizing it. They established checkpoints, used barricades to control traffic, stopped suspicious-looking persons and cars, checked IDs, and when the need arose, arrested and handed people over to the military. As they arrested, committee members engaged in long discussions about these tumultuous days of upheaval. And so at night, I joined my siblings and neighbor in a committee near my parents' home in northeastern Cairo. We talked about Egypt after Hosni Mubarak, about the military and the chaos that seemed to have engulfed our country. They would ask me, the only one spending every day in Tahrir Square, what happened in Tahrir? What happened with the revolution today? Repeatedly, I would tell them, you are part of the revolution, only to be dismissed. For these Egyptians, just like for the regime and millions of others, the revolution was in Tahrir. I grew physically and emotionally exhausted, torn between two places. The square was the site of the famous camp where an alternative republic was forming. Northeastern Cairo, about 12 miles and a half from Tahrir, was becoming its own alternative government, no matter that most of the actors saw themselves not as revolutionaries, but as neighborhood watch. Both sites embodied astounding formulations and practices of power by everyday Egyptians in a time of revolutionary crisis. Yet, the global spotlight shone only on Tahrir. At the time, I couldn't seem to reconcile the two places in one story. Even as I thought of myself as a bridge between the two, the events were just too overwhelming. It was only in 2012, during the second phase of my research, that I noticed that activists had begun to critique Tahrir. The square was no longer the utopian space where united Egyptian revolutionaries were building an alternative society. Now it seemed that people had realized that the fixation on Tahrir was limiting, that it had obscured other developments during the uprising. New questions swirled. Was Tahrir Square a blessing or a curse for the revolution? Could it be both? Do revolutions have boundaries? What counts as a revolutionary space, especially in a moment of flux? If the revolution by definition is a moment of rupture, is there one rupture or many? I began to analyze the revolution by blending my ideas around the when and the where of the revolution. This is a table of contents of the book. And so in short, overall, the Revolution Squared attempts to answer one key question: how the revolution defined by their spatio-temporal contexts. I consider this question in relation to the 2011 Egyptian revolution by asking, how and why did Egyptian revolution become solely associated with, and in turn reduced to the events in Tahrir Square? How did the naming and narrowing effect, how did this naming and narrowing effect affect the developing events? 3, how did all of these processes contribute to the dramatic expansion of political space in the immediate aftermath of revolution and the equally dramatic contraction of the space in the years that followed? So this is a table of content. I'll only bring some threads from the chapter 1, which is like bring the theoretical argument of the book, and some examples from the rest of the book, which is the notion of revolution as lived contingency. So often scholars of the Egyptian revolution have bombarded us with some of these questions, which is a very important question, but they may be so simple, such as, did the Egyptian revolution succeed or fail? And even though we have to acknowledge that actually it's a complex event, there's no one big, easy success or failure, maybe so many, you know, but we really want to jump to this big conclusion about success, ultimate success and ultimate failure. Why the Egyptian military sided with the Egyptian uprising? And is it easy? Maybe it's not. And things are more complex than that, as my analysis will show. Why Egyptian revolutionary actors didn't have a plan for change? You just want to topple dictator, but didn't have a plan. Is it common? Perhaps most revolutions didn't have a plan from day one. Plans are developed in the course of events. Which factions are to blame the most of the failure of the Egyptian revolution? Easy questions that's maybe politically derived or factionalist or positivist, like we need to jump to outcome quickly. But we need to look at deeper questions as some of why Tahrir, what's the naming, what's the processes, what's the expansion of places and dramatic expansion and reduction of spaces and so forth. To get into deeper questions and to look at the story as a process or series of processes, I developed this framework where I have like 3 premises. I'll come to the central concept that helped me in my research, revolution as lived contingency, after stating these premises. First, any adequate account of any revolution should take into account both revolution and counter-revolution. Any revolution, by definition, entails 2 big processes: expansion of possibilities, explosions of possibilities. Things can be done. We can change order. There's no limits to imagination, supposedly, right? But at the same time, from day one, counter-revolution is instigated. Counter-revolution doesn't come out of nowhere after the course of like initial success to fight back. Counter-revolution from day one organized with different iterations. So to do justice to a revolutionary event, we have to take into account both possibilities and containments, revolution and counter-revolution. Premise 2, if we agree that with the established historical and sociological research that revolutions are messy affairs, they are not just one story. It's a big event that cuts through many levels with millions of people participating, with so many stories and so forth. So to do justice to this story, we have to take seriously the confusions and contradictions of revolutionary actors, those who made it happen, not just the leaders and not just the big factions. What happened with the military? What happened with the Muslim Brotherhood? We need to take orderly revolutionary actors seriously into our analysis. 3, in order to better understand the trajectory of revolutions, specifically defeated ones, we need to look at how things happen on the ground. Of course, I acknowledge, and I'm privileged historically to be able to be there. And it's quite a burden, and I have 2 methodological appendixes where I show that this is give me incredible accessibility, but at the same time was like overwhelming in unlimited ways. It was difficult emotionally, with things are unfolding and so forth. Yet I know and I can affirm that it's really critical to think or to look at how things unfolded on the ground, not just on the spectacle world. And it's not, I know social media was critical, and I analyzed the social media, like 2.5 chapters in depth about the rise of social media, the peak 2011 and so forth, and 2013 and aftermath, digital repression, and so forth. But yet revolutions happen on the ground. So my methods is I had different layers of methods, and I call this overall as a historical ethnography, which is combining first I had ethnographies, interviews, and documentary and historical research. And this happened through three phases, three research trips. First trip is from February to in 2011 that overlapped with the revolution itself. Another trip was 6 months in 2012, and then another trip that lasted for 4 weeks, around 4 weeks in 2015-16. And I have lots of stories about my positionality. I'll move on, but I'll just to give you a glimpse, like this is a friend in the morning of Mubarak's ousting. We were tired, lacking sleep, and a friend of mine who's an Egyptian Canadian, who's a surgeon, dental surgeon, and who was living at Ann Arbor at the same time, and I was like teaching at dental school. Out of the blue, in the midst of millions, I ran into him, and we ended up spending the day together, and so forth, and giving food and water to protesters and so forth, and marching to the presidential palace and so forth. And this is the eve, the night of that day, when after Mubarak's ousting, we're really full of joy. Maybe we perhaps prematurely celebrating, but we're still like a genuine celebration about being capable of ousting a dictator who was in power for 30 years. So as I mentioned earlier, the simple question doesn't help us think about deeper issues, problems, or paradoxes that really need further explanation. Some of these are the following. First is that this is not a revolution in the first place. Mainstream, common, like it's a revolution, or it's a reformist revolution, or just an uprising, or maybe I acknowledge there's lots of debates about what is a revolution in the first place, but it's only ones that succeeded, regardless what does it mean. They can earn this title, But the idea that this is not a revolution in the first place, but then after that, same scholars would suggest that we have to think about revolutionary everyday life. Like, is it a revolution or is it not revolution? Is not clear. Two, this is only a democratic revolution. There is no social. At best, the social grievance, worker strikes, and all these issues were secondary, But at the same time, many scholarships, some of the same scholars suggest or try to bring up working class strikes or things that came afterwards. Like they vanish and come back. So there's some sort of hostility to the social, if we might, from my perspective. Three, there's something in political science, colleagues and friends, they address this notion of transition or the paradigm transition to democracy, and something I describe as transitionologists without transitionology. Or those who study revolution and they say this is a revolution, or this is an uprising, or a revolution situation. So transition paradigm is very linear, that doesn't work here, yet they study everything happened after February 11th, after the ousting of the dictator, as separate from the revolutionary grievance, revolutionary actors, election process. So I describe this as transitionologists without transitionology. So in simple terms, revolutionary actors didn't vanish. They continue to organize through elections and through streets. And I have an entire chapter to discuss the connection between revolutionary mobilization that continued through the coup to election and the constitutional order and so forth. And also, one of the main flaws in this literature is the lack of poor analysis of counter-revolution. A counter-revolution comes out of nowhere suddenly in 2013, like with the military coup. How it happened, how it came to be, and so forth. So in my work, I examine how, and this is how some of this literature suggests that, the military came in the night or the late evening of 28th of January 2011, coming in the streets, and they were welcomed and and revolutionary were chanting, people and the army are one hand, and so forth. However, the story is more complex, and there's a notion from some of this scholarship, notion of fraternization about the relation between the military and the police. On the ground, the situation was very more complex, as I will discuss briefly, and I can translate literally how this tank was, the graffiti on the tank. It says, literally states, "Down was a tyrant, the son of the bitch." So how dare protesters throwing graffiti on swearing at the commander-in-chief on a military tank? So I showed lots of examples and evidence about the battle of sovereignty and who has the ultimate power when soldiers begging protesters to go down, begging them to get out of the tanks, but protesters refuse. It's a symbolic power fight about who has the ultimate sovereignty in Tahrir here, and so forth. So this is one thesis, the revolution thesis that I criticize, how things are nuances and protesters sleeping under tanks, stopping them from encroaching on Tahrir and so forth, and like lots of bravery acts and so forth. The second thesis is the revolution thesis, as suggested famously by Professor Asif Bayat in Urbana-Champaign, a leading scholar of revolution social movement in the Middle East, and I admire Professor Bayat's work, but I have issues with the revolution thesis, which is simply, this is a revolution, which is a mixed bag between reform and revolutions. The revolution, in short, according to the Bayat, is like, it's a revolutionary movement that emerged to compel the incumbent states to change themselves. Of course, Dr. Bayat doesn't tell us why the military decided to act on behalf of the protesters and so forth. And I describe this as a teleological analysis. Like we are jumping to the conclusion that the military took advantage until like February 11th, when the military ousted the protesters ousted Mubarak, and Mubarak delegated his authorities to the military and so forth to overcome or to maneuver and so forth. Another problem in Dr. Bayat's analysis, like counter-revolution is really not important. It's really irrelevant. And quote, the question is not whether the counter-revolution was responsible for stalling or hijacking. The question is whether the revolution was revolutionary enough to offset the purpose of restoration. I see this as problematic and ahistorical, because revolution and counter-revolution work together. Like it's not, the problem here is not blaming revolutionaries only for all the problems of what's happening, but really it's ahistorical because it doesn't see how the momentum shifts. The question of momentum or the power dynamics between revolution and counter-revolution almost non-existent in the analysis. So in my work, I show that even if we trace, I'm only talking about counter-revolution in Egypt, the internal dynamics. But of course, there is regional and international. I know our tax money are supporting dictators, and tear gas shipments didn't stop flooding Egypt during the course of the revolution and aftermath to the military, and supporting Muslim Brotherhood, supporting military and blessing the coup no matter what. Regional powers, Saudis and Emiratis. I'm not discussing this, I'm alluding to it in the book. But even in the context of Egypt, I show that counter-revolution shifted all the time, actors and action. From the time of revolutionary crisis, during the transitional period, and during the coup and beyond. And lots of the strategies vary. So the composition of the counter-revolution changes, and the action of the counter-revolution changes. In doing so, we can do justice to be temporally sensitive or historically rigorous to think of how counter-revolution work. So I moved on to my approach, and Ivan Ermakov was here, and I'm glad to be here. He's one of my colleagues that I'm inspired by his work and have a good conversation with them. So actually, try to think about revolutions. How we think of revolutions as uncertainty. We need to think positively about these uncertainties. It's not enough to say that everything is unpredictable in revolutions. Everything is uncertain. It's true, but how this work? So Ivan gave us some interesting starting points about we need to think of the indeterminacy and how actors think of this indeterminacy. And also, we need to think it in positive ways. And one of the things that Ivan suggests is the idea that mutual uncertainties between actors. It's one aspect of uncertainty is how actors didn't know what's happening next. And we need to know, such as the relation of the military and protesters. We didn't know what to expect from the military. The military even didn't know what to expect. So they tried to beg them to leave the square. They tried to squeeze them. They stopped military. They stopped military aid and medical aid, equipment, food, blankets. They arrested, arrested and harassed protesters and so forth. Protesters on the other side, this is the anchor of the state. The military had a history, legacy, anti-colonial legacy from Nasser time and so forth. But still, it's a black box. We don't know what they will do, acting siding or not siding, and so forth. So here, this is how I define contingency with this big magical term in historical research into my research, to think concretely as lived by revolutionary actors. So I define revolution as lived contingency in this way. How revolutionary actors practice and experience the revolution, particularly in terms of the actions you do or you don't take in relations to the possibilities, unpredictabilities, and practices of power during the course of revolution. The idea of practicing power is really critical here, not just because of the example I mentioned about the popular committees. I'll be happy to discuss this in the Q&A, but there's lots of really instances of practicing sovereignty on Tahrir, erecting barricades, arresting citizens, arresting officers, and handing them to the military. That's like power. If not the power of arrest is taken seriously in a discussion, in a context where the security apparatus is almost collapsing, or half of it, the police part, power to arrest. What else you can take as a sign of sovereignty, practicing power on the ground? Uncertainties and unpredictabilities from the point of view of revolutionary actors have positive connotations, really experiencing both sense of possibilities. We don't know. Mubarak, that we will have a new regime, a new government, Mubarak will leave. There's no one concrete example about what is the possibilities would entail. What's the limit of these possibilities? Lived contingency, I suggest, is not only limited to the context of revolutionary crisis, but it fades with time. But the peak of it is revolutionary crisis or revolutionary situation, or when the period where the regime is incapable of repressing and protesters practice sovereignty or so forth. So I suggest that lived contingency had 3 dimensions. Agency dimension, I'll move on quickly to examples. First is agency. So lots of ideas here, but the general idea that, transformation, so many transformations happening to ordinary people are becoming very hyper-political. I talk to siblings and people I never expected to be political cab drivers. They talk about government, military, barricades, arrests, Mubarak, future, government, constitution, lots of big things I never expected. And we remember the famous Lenin phrase about the decades where nothing happens and there's some weeks where decades happen. So people are hyper-politicized, and also people, they need to decide quickly about events and actions. They seem to be decisive on turning point. Should I go to this rally or not? Should I go to Tahrir or not or not? What to do with my kids? Lots of stories about planning, food, what to do, what to wear, and it's not trivial about what to wear in a rally, about protection plan A, B, C, and so forth, and we will have life immunization, what to do, and so forth. 2, it's specialized, it's spaced. So in other words, these decisions are about things to take control in certain spaces, not just in social media spaces, digital spaces, but also streets, barricades, neighborhoods, main square, where rally in the front of the parliament building, we shut the government literally when you block cabinet or parliament, not in the sense of our Democrat and Republican talking about shutting down the government through budget. Actually, people shutting down government through their bodies, There is abundance of revolutionary spaces in these contexts. There is also a big challenge between the space and place are blurred. It's like Tahrir is the embodiment, Tahrir is physical, but Tahrir is an icon, Tahrir is a symbol, Tahrir is, it's a means of liberation, literally in Arabic, and so forth. Also, the tension between revolutionary and non-revolutionary spaces. Actors have to navigate, like, are you in or out, and this is the most, the Tahrir is a revolutionary space, but other places are not, or less revolutionary. Who decide and how, and so forth. The idea about liberated zones, how to manage liberated zones, what's the authorities about these liberated zones, when to erect barricades, can we move them, what type of barricades, and so forth. So there's lots of things about actors have to navigate in relation to spaces. The third point that's really dear to me, and I had to grapple with it a lot, about something I describe as radical and uncalculated unbounding, which is, here's how I define it. I would say one word about it: to move quicker. This refers to how revolutionary actors lose many commitment to normal everyday concerns of work, career, and family, loved ones, and future. Or rather, because of a very dear attachment to these issues, revolutionary actors become willing to take the highest risk of all, to die, to make things better on these fronts. In some sense, these issues can earn some existential meanings and connotations. Radical or uncalculated unbounding means that an actor is willing to die, feeling that they have no choice or one choice, like either live freely or die. I didn't coin the term. It's yes, and literally in the book, it seems like I coined the term, but it came out of many series of conversation with so many colleagues and comrades across the globe. And then a very final version about this was proposed by a colleague, Rashad Antonius, professor in Canada, Egyptian Canadian, and this is what you're describing. I will come back to this. I'll give you one example about radical and uncalculated unbounding. Quote from a colleague, one of my interviewees interviewed before ousting Mubarak. Quote, when Tahrir protesters started the sit-in on January 28 to 11 at night, they didn't have any choice. At the time, there was the Mubarak regime and his security apparatus, which seemed to be defeated at the time on one side. And the protesters have this liberated square on the other. If we would have left the square, we would have been killed. The protesters will be repressed worse than they were before. We saw it very well in the days from, January 25th to January 28th until late afternoon, when Mubarak and his security apparatus did nothing but arrest leading activists and kill protesters. At the time, we couldn't think of any big strategies. We just tried to save ourselves and save the uprising. If we could die outside the square anyway, why not die here for the sake of the uprising? So this is how the logic of the radical and uncalculated unbounding. This picture is actually me on the left, and it's taken by a friend, second day of arriving to Tahrir. And this is not in the book, and it's just to share with you here is that out of the blue, we ran into two bearded men, and like I was told, like, don't you go from the main barricades entrance in Qasr Nil Bridge, you go from another barricade from Mohammed Mahmoud Street, which is a more smaller street where tanks are not there, so protesters have more control on that barricades. Just to clarify, the military has no control in Qasr Nil, but they have the outer layer, they have some tanks and so forth. So I was told a tip that this is a safer and better barricades or entrance point. So out of the blue, we ran into these two bearded men. My very second day in Tahrir Square, coming from the US, tired and sleep. And I had hundreds of thoughts about, should I go to responding to them? They're asking us to help carrying the big piles of blankets. So I worry, should I go with those guys? They appear like Islamists, and I don't care. But the regime is making propaganda about Islamists and so forth. But what about the Mubarak militia? But I'm dying to help. I want to do. I'm literally walking to the uncertain. I didn't know what will happen to us. We'll be taken, confiscated the blankets, arrested by the military police, and so forth, even though I was told that this barricade or this entrance was safer. So literally, this scene reflects this whole thing about walking to the uncertain, guided by only a dream about freedom with contingencies and lots of crazy difficult way of calculating and so forth. I'm giving 3 quick examples briefly and to wrap up about how revolution as lived contingency happened in different moments. So the very night of the uprising, the very night before it was evacuated by force, and then the protesters reconvened and evacuated by force in 25th of January at night, violently. But then they regathered in 28th. So the very night, the very first night, the very first meeting by activists, they decided what to do. So they would describe it as a tree meeting and near KFC in Tahrir Square. And the actors told me, actually, there was a series of meetings. There was not one meeting. Many people came and we didn't have a plan. We decided the only thing we can do is just we're occupying the space until Mubarak leaves. So occupy, not to occupy, what to do, and so forth. Another example, in March 19th, 2011, there was the first constitutional reform or amendments. The military took over and the military decided we'll draw a political map, procedure map to transition to democracy under our guidance, of course. I can talk more about that, what does it mean, and so forth. And like some of the biggest paradoxes in the Egyptian revolution were the military, an anchor of the deep state, leading transition to democracy against the very own regime that they are the anchor of. So it doesn't make sense. But the US is giving blessings and so forth. So protesters were divided, revolutionaries were divided. Should we vote yes or no? Voting yes, some revolutionaries voted yes too, because we want to shorten the period under the auspice of the military as short as possible, to the most extreme limit as possible. But others, pro-status quo, Muslim Brotherhood, so like this is an electoral, quickly we can do that. We can take advantage of this story. Revolutionaries also, so in other words, there was revolution cut across both yes and no. It was a big decision. Revolutionary actors thought that it's a very existential, the fate of revolution will decide about this vote and so forth. Example 3, about the movement campaign rebel that was formed earlier in 2015 against the elected president Mohamed Morsi, democratically elected president, who, as we know, some of you don't know, was from the Muslim Brotherhood and was ousted in the coup, by the events of the coup. So actors were divided, many revolutions were divided. And I show in the book, it's a very simplistic to say that this movement was entirely orchestrated by the military, or entirely organic. So the Muslim Brotherhood's narrative is that it's entirely orchestrated by the military. There is no genuine grievance whatsoever in this campaign. But in the military side, or the deep state, or the pro-status quo, they said it's an entirely organic movement to expel the fascists, whatever exclusive, whatever exclusion dictated. But actually, the movement was really complex. It has infiltration, and genuine revolutionaries, and many are confused and say, we ousted Mubarak and we ousted the military to some degree and we have an election. Why not? We ousted guy and have the real revolution that we should have had from day one. So there was a big divisions about that. So it's like, and it's a serious decision about what to do and so forth. To wrap up, some empirical conclusions or thoughts. Like really, it's really simplistic and shallow to say whose fault is the most. It's kind of ridiculous because so many actors made mistakes, many successes. It's the epistemic fallacy of the elephant, if you might. This is the revolution. Like it's a tail. So we can't blame one. It's a military or but also I don't want to give too much credit to the counter-revolution because, my work and my research is try to do justice to the thickness of the agency of revolutionary actors, normal revolutionary actors, ordinary revolutionary actors. And I admit they made big mistakes, many mistakes, but to do justice to this as well, but not to give the entire credit to the counter-revolution. 2, they practiced power. Despite all these mistakes, they practiced power. And I want to do justice to this story about practicing sovereignty on the ground. 3, the discourse about Egyptians betrayed democracy is really simplistic. Egyptians wanted and died and debated challenged the meaning of democracy for like two long years. From 2011 to 2013, nobody would dare, a revolutionary or a scholar or observer, to say that I predicted what will happen next. Analytical, we need to develop more frameworks about more ethnographic and temporally sensitive to revolution as a process. 2, yes, revolution outcome indeed matter, but we need to look at how the processes that made this outcome take place in the first place. And indeed, outcome is not one thing, is not the final outcome. We can debate a lot. What do you mean by the outcome? Regime change, or social change, or institutional change, or culture change. We need to think seriously more on the notion of outcome. Neither the revolution or counter-revolution is a coherent or static. They don't work in a vacuum, and they're always dialectical. Unpredictabilities indeed happen and exist in every revolution, but this applies not only in most scholarship, we think about only focus on the question of unpredictabilities of revolution, of their occurring. But what about unpredictabilities and uncertainties during the course of revolution? In other words, the micro, meso levels of how we think of unpredictabilities. Successes and failures are not one thing. A single revolution possibly will have so many successes and failures. For the sake of time, I'll stop here. Thanks.